The agenda of this expert discussion is first the welcoming, which also includes a presentation of the results of the Global Sovereign Debt Monitor 2022, published by Alasia and MISEREOR. Second, this is followed by a keynote speech. And third, it follows by a moderated panel discussion. The main question of this discussion is, what is the role of the G7 in solving global debt crisis? On the one hand, of course, the G7 have become smaller creditors in the past 10 to 15 years compared to the private and public creditors such as China or India, that are not G7 countries. But on the other hand, the G7 has a strong voice in international institutions, and in particular in international financial institutions and fora such as the G20, and can therefore support solutions to prevent and solve debt crises in the global south. This includes, for example, an insolvency procedure for state, and also the rapid implementation of the common framework for debt treatment beyond DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. At this event, we really want to discuss perspectives to solving the global debt crisis together with you and with politicians. This event is organized, as you know, against the background of the current G7 finance ministers meetings, which really just takes place since yesterday until tomorrow. On Twitter, the German finance minister Christian Lindner said that he is worried about the situation in developing countries that could face difficult situations due to high debt and food costs, and that he will advocate in the circle that international rules to be introduced to respond to debt crisis. Whatever this means, we should discuss today. We are really looking forward to the solutions the G7 should really propose, and for a really lively discussion. So please take part in the discussion. So I finish now with some technical notes. We have a hybrid event. We have about 100 persons taking part in this event. And we have several persons here in Bonn and also via Zoom. And it will last from 6 to 8 o'clock p.m. CEST. I will now hand over to my colleague Klaus Schilder from MISEREOR, who will give a presentation on the Debt Monitor report. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Well, Your Excellency, Ambassador Webson, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests here in the room, on behalf of MISEREOR, I'm also very happy to welcome you all, both here in the room, but also in your screens, whether it's in Germany or all over the world from where you're following us, to this afternoon expert discussion. I feel very privileged that we are able, at least in this group, to meet face to face, and I hope this will be just the start of many more opportunities to engage. The pandemic and the Russian war in Ukraine exacerbated the systemic failures we've been witnessing within the financial architecture and increased the economic, the social, but also the climate vulnerabilities to which developing countries are exposed to. Once more, the most vulnerable people in low and middle income countries are suffering the most severe impacts. The multiple crises we face are also undermining the achievement of the Agenda for Sustainable Development, and we've been witnessing a demonstration, a manifestation this afternoon on the marketplace here in Bonn, where I've been discussing this. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres highlighted that the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified the long-standing negative trends in development financing, and I quote him, "Many governments currently face an impossible choice between debt servicing or saving lives." According to his analysis, 25 countries are spending more debt service than on education, health, or social protection spending combined. The creation of fiscal space in general has been a challenge, exacerbated by the pandemic and the consequent multiple crises the current economic and financial system has not been able to address. One of the most important challenges towards a transformative and fairer financial architecture is debt justice, and this is what we are going to discuss today. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the global debt situation has deteriorated. Together with Erlasia.de, we analyzed the debt situation worldwide in our global sovereign debt monitor. According to our investigations, 135 from 148 countries examined in the global south are critically indebted. The multiple crises increased the already high debt problems, both externally and internally, domestically, experienced by southern countries. According to our analysis, 39 countries are critically indebted, more than 3 times than before the pandemic started. Among them are countries in all income categories and world regions. Private creditors are particularly responsible for the deadlock in solving the debt crises. They have massively refused to participate in debt relief initiatives for the poorest countries during the COVID-19 crises. The massive expansion of multilateral crisis financing allows private creditors to exit from debtor countries without having to take any losses themselves. Last year, 58 low and middle income countries paid more in interest to external private creditors than they received in form of new loans. We will discuss possible solutions to this vicious circle, if you wish, later on. For many countries, their fiscal situation is unsustainable. They transfer more resources to creditors through debt service than they receive through new loans. While it was possible to avoid a massive sovereign default wave last year, in many cases, this was only possible through implementing rigorous austerity measures and taking on new debt. This morning, and we heard that from Catherine, German Finance Minister Christian Lindner spoke on the doorsteps of the Petersberg Hotel ahead of the finance ministers' meeting, and I quote him, "We are concerned about developing and emerging economies with very high debt ratios." Well, we are concerned as well, Mr. Lindner, but we not necessarily agree with the political steps that have been taken so far. Measures by the G20 and thus by the G7 as well so far have not led to any substantial debt relief. In many countries, debt service is maintained at the expense of public service. Already back in 2021, public spending was cut in 83 low and middle income countries to enable them to continue with debt service. More than half of the most critical indebted countries are excluded from current G20 debt relief measures. At the same time, the breathing space created by the debt moratorium and substantial liquidity report has not been used to take overdue reforms of the debt architecture. We feel that people in the global south cannot wait any longer. Their daily livelihoods and well-being depend on rapid solutions to the devastating effects of global indebtedness. Debt has a very ugly face if public funding for schools or for doctors is cut below the minimum. Thus, the German G7 presidency comes at an important time in which decisive steps can still be taken to create sustainable solutions to global debt crises. We call on Christian Lindner and his colleagues to take bold and urgent action to solve the global debt crisis now. G7 has key responsibility to live up to in starting the right steps towards a sustainable transformation of the global debt architecture. But now, I will turn the floor over to my dear colleague, Patricia Miranda from Latindat. Together with Patricia, I had the privilege to serve as co-chair for the Civil 7 Working Group on Economic Justice and Transformation. Patricia is based in La Paz, Bolivia, and she will join us online. She has been working as Global Advocacy Director at the Network for Economic and Social Justice, Latindat, since 2018. Prior to that, she has represented Latindat on Finance for Development since 2006. She is leading on analysis and advocacy on debt and private finance at global and regional level, including the UN, G20, G7, and the international financial institutions. She was also co-chair of the International Financial Architecture Working Group of the Civil Seven in Italy. Patricia, I'm very happy to see you again. I'm delighted that we have you here. So you have the floor. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. It's very nice to see you, whether only by screen, and greetings to all the audience that is present over there and also connected by Zoom. Thanks for the invitation and for having me here on a key subject that has that we all together, as you mentioned, were working on more hard than ever in the last months. It has been also a very important experience for me to be part of the Civil Seven, to work with all of you, but especially in this context. We as civil society organizations have our expectations with Germany as the leader of the G7 this year, in a challenging context, a very challenging context where the whole world is living the worst crisis in more than 100 years. And the subject that brings us here today is debt, and this is part of this challenging context that we are facing now. That rising trends have been escalated without having timely debt crisis prevention policies. That has reached a new peak, and public debt of the overall global total debt has increased in a more representative way. Unfortunately, debt has been a key source to finance needs to face the pandemic in developing countries. And now, again, it is a source to fund and to face the war impacts. The increase of debt has reached the largest single-year increase since at least 1970. Debt levels will continue to rise, as we can see in the trends and we can see in the day-to-day in our countries. Will continue to rise in the near future, and there is the risk to have more low and middle income countries in debt distress, or the risk of over-indebtedness in the following years. The global debt policies adopted after the COVID-19 outbreak did not address prevention nor resolution of this situation. The lack of will to implement proper, bold policies is definitely leaving millions behind, where women, as we all know, carry the highest burden of the crisis impacts. What is needed in terms of global debt policies? And this is what I am going to address and to emphasize today. First, an urgent debt relief should have been implemented. We as CSOs have been calling for a debt relief from the beginning of the pandemic. Vulnerable countries are prioritizing debt servicing over health, over social protection, food, and other urgent needs in this multiple crisis, which for people and for families that are exposed to a variety of vulnerabilities is a matter of life or death. It is a global crisis, and as a global crisis, the losses are huge. However, inequalities are reflecting how the poorest and the most vulnerable lose almost everything, and the capital power is not willing to lose at all. But it is not late, because debt relief is still much needed now. From all creditors, for vulnerable, low, and also middle-income countries. Not a debt service suspension, that is what some countries have, that only defers the problem and increase debt service burden for the following years, but a debt service cancellation for at least 2 to 3 years, so fiscal resources can actually prioritize people's needs instead of prioritizing debt service payment. Criteria for beneficial countries should include other aspects beyond the single fiscal capacity of debt payment, which has been mainly taken into account. There are experiences and lessons learned, such as, for instance, what was the HIPIC initiative and the criteria used at that time in terms of debt sustainability analysis with realistic projections, with a comprehensive analysis and ratios on the current debt landscape of the total public debt, which includes domestic debt as well, and linked with national development plans. So a debt relief initiative can also be linked or hand to hand with the development and urgent needs of a country. A second point is that developing countries also need the establishment of a debt restructuring mechanism. The common framework, in our view, has failed, and it's not simply a matter of implementation. It is a matter of design. The deepest issue is that it is still a process led by creditors, but mainly creditors, where debtor countries are in a position of less or no power, and they end up in the position to take it or not. Well, after more than a year, we all see that most countries decided not to take it. And the only 3 countries that did are still struggling to make it succeed. There are several problems in terms of capacities to face a renegotiation, to have transparency in the whole process, to have access to data and information, in terms of debt sustainability criteria that goes, as I mentioned before, beyond the capacity to repay external debt only, and also in terms of a binding creditor participation. Therefore, a deep transformation is needed through an international board of debt arbitration in the aegis of the United Nations. So all parties can sit at the same table to decide together on a fair, transparent, comprehensive, timely, sustainable, and long-term debt resolution. With the current trends, it is starting to get late for many cases, for many countries. But the G7 and the G20 can still do something, can promote and lead and kick off the establishment of a debt workout mechanism in the United Nations and start to set the path to start the discussions, the pillars, and how this could be implemented. The G7 can also implement national laws for their countries to involve private creditors for at least from G7 countries in a binding manner to protect as well debtors in the process, something that debtors' rights are not really in the front line to be protected. A good basis for this is that the German government's coalition agreement mentions a new consensus on international debt management in the form of an initiative for a codified international sovereign insolvency procedure. The procedure should cover all creditors and provide debt relief for groups of countries that are especially at risk. So the implementation of this would be an important step forward, and this looks like it could be really the basis towards this change, towards starting a different process for debt resolutions. All creditors have to participate, and this is what the German government is saying, and this is what the world is saying and needs. Whether China has increased its participation as a bilateral creditor to include it as the key creditor in a process that remains with no visible results is not the solution and does not have to be the reason for blocking and not moving onto a better process. Moreover, when private and multilateral creditors are still by really far, if we compare them with China, are the most important creditors. Therefore, a different approach to involve all creditors is needed. And this is the proposal that civil society organizations have been demanding for many years. Continuing with the support and the rely on current initiatives that are having such a scarce progress will lead to more profound problems to deal with in the near future. Even more considering the additional risks as the increase of interest rates, plus more new loans and new debt to face the crisis is an explosive formula. Considering the increasing needs such as the food crisis, increase of poverty, climate crisis, and health recovery, because whether developed countries see themselves already in a post-COVID phase, many developing countries don't see themselves there yet. So there are many challenges and many needs that need to be addressed. Finally, a systemic, a holistic approach is needed in terms of debt and other issues that are strongly related with it, as the role of credit rating agencies, as the accomplishment of the commitments to bring access to concessional finance for developing countries, and overall a new economic and financial architecture where these the points that I mentioned today are bold steps that really need to be taken now, as I mentioned, in the worst crisis that we are living and where millions of people are actually being left behind. Thank you so much.
Patricia, can I be heard well? Okay. Thank you very much. I think that was already a lot of food for thought. It really set the scene for the following discussion very well. I'm Christina Rehbein. I'm the political coordinator of Jubilee Germany, one of the co-organizing organizations. And we will discuss the resolution of debt crisis and the role of the G7 with a fantastic panel today. There is Thomas Scheckermann from the G7 Presidency, the German Finance Ministry. He's responsible for multilateral development banks, debt restructuring, and the Paris Club. Very welcome. He joined us virtually. There is His Excellency Walton Alfonso Webson. He's the permanent representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations and the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. He is with me today in Bonn. Very welcome. There is Marcelo Estevao, the Global Director for the Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice at the World Bank Group, also joined virtually. Very welcome. There is Dennis Shen, Director in Sovereign Ratings with Scope Ratings, a Berlin-based European rating agency, also with us virtually. Welcome to you too. And last but not least, Professor James Gatti, law professor at the Chicago School of Law, editor of Afronomicslaw.org, and the representative of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, with us today virtually as well. Very welcome. It's really an honor and it's a true pleasure to have you with us today. Before we dive into the discussion, very quick logistical remarks to all the virtual participants. Please post your comments, your questions in the Q&A function. My colleagues Mara and Elise, they will moderate your contributions and will transmit your questions to me. There will be the opportunity for some of the comments and questions to be expressed verbally. My colleagues will approach you. People in the room can, of course, also ask questions directly to the panel. There is a microphone over there that you can use. After the first round, I will open the floor. Without further ado, let's start with the discussion, and let's start with the G7 presidency. Mr. Scheckermann, I think you have already been addressed several times by the speakers that we've already heard. There are lots of expectations on the G7 presidency and on the G7 meeting today, and especially lots of expectations on the German government, given the coalition treaty agreement on a codified sovereign debt workup mechanism. And I think there also has been quite a lot of discussion already, if you like, on the common framework, lots of skepticism on the common framework. The uptake is low, the process is slow. So the question is, especially when it comes to the G7 meeting today, what can we expect from the G7 finance ministers to make debt relief, debt resolution much more quicker and comprehensive?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me in this discussion today. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you that are listening to us. Yeah, that's true. I'm responsible also for debt strategy issues in the Ministry of Finance, and I would like to stress that the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment allows for debt restructuring to be agreed on with eligible countries in need. We want that the G7 underscore their commitment to successfully implementing the common framework for debt treatment and improving it where possible. This means, in particular, contributing to a timely, orderly, and coordinated implementation of the common framework, which is, however, not easy given that it is a G20 framework. But the common framework is a great step forward in the international financial architecture. Emerging creditors have committed to participate in requested restructurings. There may be criticism, as we have experienced just here now, that up to now there has been not any debt restructuring yet, but the G7 are working hard on improving the current regrettable situation. The Paris Club Chair France is also co-chair in the creditor committees of the framework. Paris Club members clearly support France in this endeavor. Specifically on the necessary private sector involvement within the common framework, requesting countries have to agree on an IMF program. And one of the advantages of this setting is that the IMF program provides clear guidance how much debt service the country can pay to the creditors, including private creditors. That means the debtor country is also in a position to tell private creditors what concessions they need to make vis-a-vis the country in order to receive at least some payments from them. For this to happen in practice, the debtor country also needs support in form of technical assistance and advisory services, in particular from the relevant international financial institutions, to be able to benefit from legal and financial advice and advisors they can hire. Such advisors have to assist the country when negotiating with the private sector or individual private creditors. We continue to convey this message to all relevant IFIs, that means international financial institutions. And let me add something we do in the IMF on the issue of G7 collective reallocation of the so-called special drawing rights. Germany, together with the other G20, with the other G7, sorry, supports the total global ambition of $100 billion of voluntary contributions for countries most in need. Many countries have announced they want to participate in voluntary channeling of SDRs, mainly through the contributions to the IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and also the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. As G7 presidency, we have supported the establishment of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust and encourage other countries to contribute to this trust as well as to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust too. Germany plans to contribute a loan of 6.3 billion euro to the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, subject to parliamentary approval. The budget process in Germany is just ongoing at the moment. And we have also as a plan to contribute 100 million euro to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust subsidy account, that is also subject to parliamentary approval. So you see, Germany is doing a lot also in this regard. Maybe I stop here for this.
Thank you very much. You were saying that G7 is working hard on making the common framework effective and working. I think today in the media we have read a lot about increasing pressure on China, that this is the kind of priority of the G7 meetings to deliver debt relief. If looking at figures, I think looking at debt service payments from low-income countries and low-middle-income countries in the next 7 years, I think there is like 8% that is going to G7 governments, so not really a lot. It's 11% that goes to China. And then I think Patricia already made the point, there is a lot more going to the private sector and to multilateral creditors. I'm just wondering, what exactly are the G7 offering to China? In what ways do you want to increase pressure? Do you want to increase the incentives for China to participate in the common framework, also given the low public claims that the G7 have themselves?
Yeah, I think you are asking me, I suppose. I must say I cannot tell you before the meeting itself what is going on there on the Petersburg. You have to wait for the press conference, for the press communique. But you are right. We try to have China agreeing to more important steps. But let me also stress what has happened already. Let us take the example of Chad. In December last year, the IMF has agreed to an IMF program to Chad, and for this financial assurances were necessary. The common framework offered as a framework that not only the Paris Club creditors gave the necessary financial assurances, but also the non-Paris Club creditors of this country. So that's a big progress. And also, as I said, the IMF program sets an important framework to also include the private sector creditors. And the creditor committee, according to the common framework, is also in consultation and in talks with Glencore. Glencore is the main creditor of Chad, and there's also a group of private creditors where the voices of this group are collected, so that they can deliver their proposals to the credit committee. So you can see there's a lot going on, and now the process is that the bilateral creditors of Chad can agree on the debt restructuring for Chad. But as you probably know, at the moment the oil prices are very high, and that makes it very difficult to reach a solution there. But we are trying very hard to do so, and that's also important in view of the first review that is only some months away from us, which refers part of the IMF program. So yeah, that's what I like to answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Estevao, the World Bank has recently been very proactive in warning of grave social and economic consequences if current debt relief mechanism won't be improved. I think in the Global Economic Prospects in January 2022, the World Bank described in detail what lessons to be learned from past debt relief attempts to avoid the protracted, too little, too late, and unsuccessful debt restructurings that usually preceded more ambitious debt relief efforts that then eventually resolve debt overhangs. In the paper, you compare the common framework with the too little efforts that preceded successful debt restructurings in the 80s and 90s. What is needed to avoid the repetition of history with all the economic and social costs for both debtors and creditors?
Hi, no, thanks for the question and thanks so much for the invitation to be here with you. I mean, I'm sorry I cannot be there physically, so hello from Washington, D.C. Actually, let me put your question in the context of, I think, is a little bit more productive on what can be done right now. And that relates to the analysis that you described. So first, one needs to ask, just following up the discussion that just happened, why has progress under the common framework been so slow, for instance? Now, as you know, the G20 established the common framework as a mechanism to help countries with unsustainable debt. So in some sense, the mechanism is trying to address some of the issues that we have been mentioning in the past, that is, don't do too little too late, making sure that whatever debt treatment you have is here to stay, in the sense that puts country in a good starting point, and then help them do fiscal policy in a way that problem doesn't appear again. So anyway, so the common framework is supposed to help with the coordination issue between several creditors, which is a reason why in the past it has taken so long, because it's hard to coordinate when you have different creditors. And that's particularly true now because while, say, if you talk about the poorest countries in the world, 30 years ago, all the credits were basically just, say, the World Bank and maybe one or two G7 country for a particular country. Now it's much more diverse. Now we have many other international organizations. You have many other official creditors, like was mentioned before, and you have several of these countries with big access to the private sector funding. Anyway, so far only 3 countries have applied to the common framework. I mean, the reason for such a small take-up is similar to what we saw with the debt service suspension initiative. Many countries are still able to access private capital in international markets, and they fear that an application for the common framework will damage their credit ratings and potentially close off the access to private capital. So the official sector provides a coordination mechanism, but there's not as much take-up from the demand side, if you want, from the demand for that restructuring. So that's one issue to keep in mind. And anyway, that's why we have been quite vocal about the need for continued relief on debt service payments and for faster debt restructure under the common framework. Because if, say, the 3 countries that are now being discussed, Chad, Zambia, and Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a harder case because they are facing a kind of a civil unrest, so there is an issue there. But if you have a quicker relief there, a quick restructuring, other countries say, gee, maybe it is worth going through that, even if I may face some hardship if I want to access private capital. Now, how can the common framework produce solutions in a faster way? So we have proposed 2 straightforward fixes, which are still under discussion. There are pros and cons, but we do believe that the pros are bigger than the cons. First, bring commercial creditors to the negotiating table from the very start. There has been a tradition, certainly on Paris Club renegotiation, of first doing the official sector, and then the country would go and through comparability of treatment from the deal they got with the official creditors, bring in commercial creditors. We think that maybe having them at the negotiating table from the very start would be more helpful. If you want them to share equally the burden of debt relief, we should make the private sector equal partners in the negotiation. Anyway, to be discussed. Second, we think that having a mathematical formula applicable to all creditors to determine comparability of treatment and ensure equal burden sharing would be a good thing. So something very clear. Then we have also proposed other steps to improve the common framework. So we can have, in your question, you're basically saying, what can you do to do stuff faster? And that we did jointly with the IMF. First, we suggest establishing a clear timeline of what needs to happen when in the common framework process. For example, the creditors committee should be formed within 6 weeks of an application of a country for treatment. Second, suspend for the duration of the negotiations debt service payments for all common framework applicants. Remember that the debt service suspension initiative created the expiration at the end of last year, created kind of a cliff there. So I think it's important that if you apply for that restructuring, that your debt service gets suspended at least for the duration of the negotiations. Third, assess the parameters and processes of the comparability of treatment and clarify the rules for its implementation. That's related to our sole suggestion that I said earlier. That's a bit more radical. And fourth, expand the common framework's eligibility requirement so that other highly indebted and vulnerable countries can also apply. And this is very important because, for instance, if you look at some major crises that happen now in the world, Sri Lanka comes to mind. Anybody that is interested in this field and is reading the newspaper know what's happening there. They already defaulted on some of their debt service, but they cannot apply to the common framework because Sri Lanka is a middle income country. So I think the resistance to that proposal is that will make the pie too big. But those countries are not going anywhere. We as an international community, we still need to deal with middle income countries that will be going through a debt crisis. So anyway, I think you're right that in the past, we learned a lot from the past. I think the common framework is here to try to deal with some of these lessons. We think there is still some improvements that can be made into its functioning so that they can really deliver on the ambition that they advertise.
One quick follow-up question. You were mentioning the much more complicated creditor portfolio. I think that anyway, still multilateral creditors hold 35% of claims of low and lower middle income countries, which means it's still a very important creditor. I think in one of your publications, the World Bank described the importance of multilateral debt relief in the HIPC initiative, to resolve the debt overhang of those countries. And I'm just wondering, given the claimed preferred creditor status, multilateral creditors are excluded from the common framework, but given those lessons that the World Bank described in its papers, will in the common framework, will the multilateral creditors at some point be included? And if not, what is different today when it comes to the resolution of crisis to the debt crisis in the 1990s, which could only be resolved with multilateral debt relief?
Yeah, so first, let's keep things a little bit in perspective here, because you're asking to compare to what happened in the end of the 1990s. There's a big debt issue in the world right now. And if you look at the debt in emerging market, the developing economies, so not just the countries you mentioned, but the whole portfolio, let's say, of non-highly developed countries, the whole debt is, and that includes private debt, public debt, household debt, is stood at about 210% of GDP at the end of 2020. That's a 50-year record. Public debt in the emerging market, so just focus on public debt in emerging market developed economies, rose to levels not seen since the 1980s, and more than 30 percentage points of GDP higher than in 2010. Now, if I move to the category that you mentioned and focus just on public debt, then I would say that more than half of the countries, they are, let's call IDA. IDA is the grant arm of the World Bank. So the IDA countries, about 73 countries that are at the lower end of the development scale, about more than half are in debt distress or at high risk of it. and debt service burdens have risen rapidly. Now, what's different, again, with this group of countries vis-a-vis the end of the 90s, is that at the end of the 90s, I would say average debt to GDP ratio was like 100%. Now it's about 50% or 55%. So in terms of scale, the situation now is not as bad as then, and the countries did develop quite a bit. So if you look at the share of, say, low middle income countries within the 73 countries, and you take the same 73 countries at the end of 1990, the share of low middle income countries increased significantly. In other words, there has been development during that period. So when MDRI was instituted in the the first decade of this century, so in about 2004, was to supplement exactly that the HIPIC initiative, which was done by the official sectors, and they felt that there was a need to do something extra because the starting point was so bad. So the first reason is the starting point is not as bad now. But now that does not mean that multilateral development banks do not have a role here. They have a very strong role. So think of what we have been doing at the bank, at the World Bank. Since at the start of the COVID-19 crisis, our goal has been to enlarge the breathing space for the poorest countries. It is why we and the IMF urged the G20 countries to establish the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which delivered about $13 billion in relief to more than 40 countries before it expired last December. And then we concluded the best way to support our client countries in this context and play our, say, counter-cyclical role because of the crisis is to focus on providing large net positive flows to the world's poorest countries. So instead of saying right now, let's work on forgiving that, let's do more. Let's actually give a large net positive flow. So some countries may pay us that service, but you give them back double. Actually, the ratio is 12-1 for the aggregate of the IDA countries. So that's exactly what we have done. So if you look from April 2020 to December 2021, the World Bank committed $44.4 billion in financing for countries participating in the G20 DSSI, for instance, just to use a particular sample. Mm-hmm. And of this $44.4 billion, $16 billion was in the form of grants, so no payment needed. And we have already disbursed more than $27 billion, including $8 billion in grants to these countries. So the total disbursement amount is roughly 6 times the $4.4 billion debt service repayments received from these DSSI countries. So anyway, that has been our strategy. There is little, I think, enthusiasm for another MDRI, because for the same token, there is little enthusiasm for another EPIC, so a broad debt forgiveness program. And I think, again, it's because the starting point is not as bad as in the end of 1990s. And not all of these 73 countries are in trouble. Mm-hmm. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Ambassador Webson, during the pandemic, the Alliance of Small Island States has been very much at the forefront to demand broad-based solutions to debt crises. Last year, you called for a systemic debt shake-up at the IMF World Bank. I think it was the annual meetings. Well, what do you understand by that? We've just heard from Mr. Estevao that the common framework should be expanded to other, highly indebted countries, including small island developing states. Many of the SIDS are not part of the common framework. So is your systemic debt shake-up already the expansion of the common framework? Is that enough? And why is it needed from the perspective of SIDS?
Thank you very much. And let me say, first of all, thanks to the organizers for including the voice of SIDS. While I'm not sure if we are saying there should be a shake-up, but we're certainly saying they need to revisit some of the approaches, and I'll come to that. While the fact that we're here is part of what we're calling for. Very often, decisions are made by the G7 or others, and we are not in the conversation. So decisions are made for us. We have to live with it, and it does not address necessarily the questions as we see it. We believe there got to be some new ways and more innovative ways. Let me highlight maybe 3 or 4 things. As you know, last year, the Alliance of Small Island States laid out a very strong program as to what we think should happen for us. We are speaking of 39 countries, a number of which, half of which are in major debt distress. And we are asking, if we do not address this within the context of the current climate, current global crisis climate, we will lose and leave countries far behind. There are, in the process of this, there are countries that, island nations, island states with very small populations, but with significant debt that have to make, as you heard from what the Secretary General said, and that is quite so, we have to make choices of servicing debt while at the same time we have to make those choices over the needs of our people. One of the speakers spoke of the crisis that we live in and noted the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Well, that is an example of what the island states are saying. It's not just the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. We are living in the most dangerous climate crisis that the world has ever seen. So it's not 2 crises, it's 3. And those 3 crises, the small island states suffer with. Every other year, some Caribbean island or Pacific island will be hit by a hurricane and will lose its GDP more than, in some cases, will lose 100%, 200% of its GDP, wiped out in 24 hours. We think that the borrowers must be willing to listen. To the lending institutions and organizations must be willing to listen to the borrowers, give them a chance, give them a voice, in order that we can find sustainable debt workout mechanisms that would recognize the debt vulnerability that these island nations face. We believe that we must generate new financial instruments that can support development as well as respond to climate concerns. Those instruments can be, we have been speaking for many years of a vulnerability index to support the ongoing tools that are used within the World Bank and the IMF that measures where island nations are when we talk about graduation and so on. We believe that the vulnerability of these islands and the special circumstances that the United Nations have packaged these islands into or pocketed these islands into, which must be addressed within this, and the vulnerability index is one such tool. We believe that we could be talking about new instruments that can help to allow debt forgiveness in some cases, debt cancellation, the whole process of allowing these islands to be able to have liquid, and so that they can address their problems internally. So some debt suspension clauses, the hurricane clauses might be. We are also talking about debt for climate swap conditions. So these are new instruments that we now have to put. And some of these instruments can be made attractive to private sector donors as well as the public sector. We must foster dialogue that will incorporate the concerns of both the public sector and the private sector. Debt workout mechanisms, we believe, should be subject to reviews. We shouldn't be speaking of the debt mechanism when we hit a crisis. This is something we should be reviewing all the time so that countries can be, the matters of countries as they begin to slide can be taken into consideration, and we can address these. We cannot wait until a crisis such as we are in now, which is extremely dangerous at this time. We can't wait for that. We have to be given opportunities when we can look at this thing well, I can say every decade, but we must have a mechanism that we can revisit this regularly. We have seen some improvement but in some of the mechanism, but we are very pleased to be here because at least Germany, as the presidency of the G7, we hope that they will take a lead and be part of that process that will allow small island states an opportunity for survival by holding discussions and hearing our concerns within the context of the debt crisis that we are facing right now. I think I want to make one last point in reference to the HIPIC program, and that is which was said by our colleague from Latin America. And to say, the crisis that small islands face now is, when you look at our debt portfolio as the 39 members, we mean as a IOSIS, it's smaller than the crisis that the HIPIC countries face. And I see no reason why we could not begin a conversation to create a special window to look at the small island developing states within that context. These are some of the innovative methods that we can use that will address the issues of microstates, that will address the issues of many mini-states, and will address the issues of the Alliance of Small Island States at this time. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were saying, well, Germany, the G7, but also Germany in particular, could take the lead. I think you are aware that the German government does not only hold the G7 presidency, but that there is also a commitment in the coalition treaty, not only on a codified international insolvency mechanism, but also to establish debt relief for particularly vulnerable country groups, to which I think SIDS do count. However, Germany is only a creditor in a very few IOSIS member countries. Which role do you see for the German government to improve debt restructuring possibilities for SIDS?
As a leader, you can't hide behind the fact that I am only a creditor to very few countries. If you're going to take a leading role in global affairs, you take a leading role in global affairs, and Germany can do that. And that has to be that they can be a voice that understands the situation that many developing countries, and particularly the most vulnerable countries like the small island states are facing. Germany can lead the way in working with the islands and to make their position visible, so that other partners within G7 and G20 can see the role they play. We cannot simply only say that we are only concerned with those with whom we have had a particular relationship. Small island states within the global United Nations family are defined as island nations with special circumstances. They are defined as the most vulnerable nations. And if leading countries like Germany are not interested in that, then we have a bigger problem than we thought we had. And I believe Germany, with its Global Shield program, is beginning to show the way that they can raise their voice. And I think building alliances with the small islands, working collaboratively with the small islands, and then working with their partners within G7 so that they can be sure that the small islands' voices are heard and the small island issues are being addressed is one way that Germany can help. At the meetings of the IFI where they are leaders, at the meetings like this year when they are leading G7, and in other leadership roles. And that's what leadership is, and that's what they can do as a leader within this global fight for survival by so many nations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Webson. That were very strong words. Mr. Shen, over to you. In the context of the G20 debt relief initiatives, particularly the debt moratorium DSSI, credit rating agencies and some private creditors and the institutions successfully pushed the narrative that seeking debt treatments are not in the interest of debtor countries on the grounds of losing hard-won capital market access and jeopardizing their long-term development prospects. The narrative effectively discouraged countries from seeking debt treatments. You have, or Scope Ratings, developed the DSSI Plus proposal, effectively countering this narrative by advocating for debt restructurings with deep debt write-offs by all involved creditors as a prerequisite for market access. Could you firstly elaborate a bit on this different position compared to other private sector actors? And then secondly, what you think needs to change in currently existing debt restructuring mechanisms to ensure countries have access to the finance they need?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Christina, and thanks for the invitation to this esteemed panel. Indeed, in the 2020 paper, in terms of referencing the DSSI Plus framework, the spirit being for more comprehensive, greater comparability between creditor groups, in terms of being the underlying conditions that could open up to debt restructuring, which includes more substantive debt forgiveness and debt cancellation. And in the paper, we reference from the standpoint of a credit rating agency that over the long term, over a long run horizon, if debt restructuring is done correctly, properly, comprehensively, and with the right recognition, which has always dogged debt relief initiatives between identifying liquidity crises as compared with an underlying solvency issue, and to an extent dodging the issue when the prescription might relate more to the latter. If done properly, that over the long run, the outcome as far as credit ratings ought to be that supports the credit rating outlook for a given sovereign state, and not denigrate that credit rating. And as associated as well, then the market access as attributed to the rating of a given sovereign borrower. Again, that stated that if the underlying solvency issue, the underlying problem of debt sustainability, whether through the common framework or under an expanded framework, correctly identifies an underlying problem of over indebtedness, whether in terms of the debt stock, high interest payments as a percentage of government revenue, and then as such that the correct measures are taken through first prescribing the problem itself accurately. At this stage, certainly in terms of the debt service suspension initiative and the common framework, they represent substantive achievements since the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the liquidity provision, as far as the improvements, enhancements in debt data that's come with DSSI. No small thing. Also, as it pertains to the World Bank and IMF oversight over participating nation states. And even matters such as the non-concessional borrowing limits that then are attributed. As referenced, the bottleneck to being able to truly alleviate solvency crises and debt sustainability risk for those countries in which the debt problems have been postponed, even entering COVID-19 for probably far too long, let alone today in 2022. The core bottleneck, which I imagine many on the panel would agree with, relates to one of the equal treatment of creditors. And in the case of Africa, certainly in terms of the increased and still increasing diversification of creditor groups that are involved on the continent. which naturally makes, in terms of the degree of how onerous it is to achieve equal treatment, that much more difficult to attain. In terms of DSSI plus and more significant debt forgiveness and making that feasible and making that possible for the global community, one aspect which we believe needs to be core to a global sovereign debt restructuring model framework is aggregate collective action clauses. The concept that to a problem of collective action is an answer that includes preserving or includes assuring the joint action between individual creditor groups. That might involve, in terms of the question that was posed earlier to multilateral institutions in terms of the degree of involvement in debt relief, certainly taking from the example of the past per the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, per HIPC and the like. Certainly China has been referenced. COVID-19 is China's first involvement in global debt relief. And so in that, in terms of what you might title from a piecemeal stepwise approach, credit where credit is due. At the same time, in terms of the well-known lack of transparency of China's involvement in terms of the non-disclosure agreements and the like, naturally there's still much to be desired. And the elephant in the room being, in terms of the associated creditor groups, and one in which, in addition to China, that many African borrowers are increasingly reliant upon, which are Eurobond international debt markets and the participation of private sector creditors. And if we've learned anything from the course of history, whether in the 1980s or since, in terms of the Baker Plan and the transition to the Brady Plan and the like, it's that voluntary participation of the private sector is normally not going to work. And that in many cases it needs to involve the coercion and or to be compelled to an extent vis-a-vis the official sector. It's only through collective action that debt forgiveness, especially in a more diversified creditor world, is realizable. The difficulty level is significantly higher than it was in the 1990s. But we outlined in the paper that if done correctly, that for distressed African borrowers, debt forgiveness, even of a comparatively moderate 25% debt write-off, could present savings of 29 billion US dollars, which in and of itself could represent the difference for many distressed borrowers or those that are at risk of being labeled as a distressed borrower, the difference between a sustainable recovery and a lost decade.
Thank you very much. Well, you were saying that voluntary participation of the private sector that usually doesn't work. I think Mr. Shakerman was saying that there is clear guidance to make private sector involvement work. There is this there is an IMF program, and this is working. There's actually, or let's say, private sector participation is not a problem. Thinking again of your DSSI Plus proposal, what incentives would be necessary to ensure comprehensive debt restructurings to make PSI, private sector involvement, work? What do you mean exactly by coercion?
One thesis that I suppose some have presented is that by increasing the participation, for example, the single largest creditor in Africa on the continent these days, in terms of in past years, being the state-owned banks of China, that through the participation of China, that the private sector would feel more compelled, that participation rates would automatically increase because of the belief that one is, so to speak, not in it alone. I reserve the right to have a degree of skepticism about that in terms of even if China were to increase its participation through current negotiations in the G20 and the like, the exact response from the private sector, just because of the model of the private sector, and it's their prerogative in terms of protecting their investments and the business model. Stated because voluntary participation is difficult. I think we've seen that during during DSSI, even with the Institute of International Finance, at least creating the terms of reference for private sector involvement, more significant private sector involvement, and certainly since then as well with the common framework. And as a result of this, in terms of if the underlying issue is that voluntary action is difficult, one might be waiting for quite a long time, collective action in terms of aggregate collective action clauses, and that any supermajority in terms of voting, including institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, suppose the Export-Import Bank of China, other involved counterparties on the African continent, that would by itself result in or bring about the participation of private sector counterparties, creditors. In the interim, recognizing how difficult that suggestion indeed is in terms of ingraining such a clause in new debt, and then of course which would need to involve official sector involvement in terms of the program involvement and advisory with national governments. That in the interim, recognizing the difficulty of the suggestion, other mechanisms like Brady, like credit enhancements, a suggestion that was made by a colleague, Moritz Kramer, as a means that if there are bilateral official creditors that could provide guarantees and support the swap from non-performing old debt to performing new debt with a security guarantee that could support the attractiveness and raise voluntary participation to an extent, raise the attractiveness of participating in the debt exchange if there is a underlying business motive that could compel one to believe that there's value in the participation. Other mechanisms such as sweeteners, such as GDP warrants, we know have been used in the past, such as in Argentina 2004, Greece 2012, Ukraine 2015, and certainly in terms of the management of the process, that in terms of ensuring that whoever is providing the debt relief or the liquidity provision, that those monies are not wasted, including in terms of the assurance to the private sector, then conditionality and improvements in fiscal and debt management and structural reform to raise potential growth and hopefully bring about a more sustainable future as far as the debt trajectory, that naturally as well would serve as a positive assurance to the private sector.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dennis. Professor Gatti, the G20 established the common framework with the idea to encourage preemptive debt restructurings, which means before countries actually go to chaos. Many African countries refrained from seeking debt treatments under the framework, although, well, many countries are at the brink of the default, such as the former investor darling Ghana, or, well, listening to Kristalina and David Malpass, well, talking about a projected economic collapse and humanitarian crisis in many countries. Why do countries do not seek debt restructurings? And what, in the view of civil society, African civil society, would be needed to make debt treatments more attractive to African countries?
So thank you very much, Christina, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So to answer your question, first I want to begin by saying something that I don't think has been mentioned, that I think relates to your question, Christina, but also more generally to Germany's very important chairing of the G7 this year, which is that after the Second World War, in the London Agreement of 1950, German debt was forgiven. A large chunk of German debt was forgiven. And I can go into some of the details, but the point that I want to make here is that debt forgiveness should be on the table because part of Germany's prosperity and its fiscal prudence is traced by many people to those agreements after the Second World War. And with everything that happened in Germany resulting and leading up to the Second World War. So I think that, I don't think that indebted countries are begging for debt forgiveness. It's been done in the past. And now it's Black and brown people asking for it. And I think that they should be treated exactly the same way the creditors want to be treated, to have comparable treatment. So my first point is that this problem of sovereign debt, if we look at it from a historical perspective, the Black and brown peoples are asking for exactly what the white peoples got in recent historical memory, including Germany. And the work that we do at the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network is to go behind the headlines and to go behind the debates, to unearth these stories, to add to what the ambassador was saying, that the voices of the seats should be heard, and that's what the African countries have been saying. If you look at the International Monetary Fund, for example, until very recently, the voice and vote of African countries was minuscule, marginal, until another directorship was added, and that now Africa has 2 directorships. But Africa forms 25% of the membership of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, each separately. But under the weighted voting system of both the bank and the IMF, let's talk about the IMF since that's what we're talking about, African countries have only a 6.1% vote. So their voice in the most important institution that currently is managing the common framework and the SDRs and many of the initiatives on debt restructuring, African countries have no voice. Or have a very tiny voice. And this is by design. The post-Second World War order, as we know, is a historical accident. It's the victors of the Second World War who made it up. So, for example, Germany is not part of the Security Council because it was on the wrong side of the post-Second World War, the architects of the post-Second World War order. So I can't emphasize enough why it is that developing countries have, since they got majorities in the United Nations, have actually been asking for debt workout mechanisms that are located within the United Nations, outside of institutions like the International Monetary Fund that they don't control, outside of the Paris Club, which basically are the former colonial powers of these Black and brown countries. These are just facts. I'm speaking facts here. This is not heresy. And so I think when you hear the Ghanaian finance minister, Ofori Atta, call for rethinking the global financial system, it's not just that African countries are looking for a restructuring mechanism. They're looking for a mechanism in which, as the ambassador said, their voices are heard, and it's not that they want to continue to have their voices marginalized in forums dominated by the creditors who are basically making up the rules. I just checked to see how much Africa paid last year in sovereign debt payments. As according to the World Bank, so these are not my figures, as of October 2021, Africa owed $702 billion US dollars. It was the highest debt burden African countries had in a decade. And so from the perspective of African countries, any mechanism that is put in place to address the debt crisis, whether it's a write-off or a restructuring mechanism or the common framework, has to consider the people who don't get to have dinner right here in Nairobi, where I am today, and around many places in Africa, because their governments are experiencing spikes in debt payments, especially as a result not only of the end of the DSSI, but also as a result of all the crises that all the speakers have so well talked about tonight. So I would say, in short, that if you look at the history has been very clear, whether it's the UNCTAD's proposals on a debt resolution mechanism or a debt workout mechanism. They've wanted to relocate decision-making power away from the creditors and to include the debtors so that decision-making can be more democratic and include the voices of everybody on the table and not just promote the interests of the creditors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. One final question before we open the floor. Well, you were saying, or you're advocating for taking away powers from the creditors. We are meeting today at the brink of the G7 finance ministers meeting, and although I think the G7 don't really have any creditor power anymore, they are still creditors, and I think, well, African countries or debtor countries, they are not at the table of the G7. So what role do you see for the G7, also for the German government being the G7 presidency, to improve or to make, well, debtor countries' voices heard? I think you muted, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So I think there are a couple of things. I think one of the things, especially because Germany, as I said, has had its own history of debt forgiveness. My study, I'm not an expert in German history, but my study of the question of indebtedness and sovereigns who are regarded as laggards, Germany was one of those in the early 20th century. And so when its debt was forgiven, much of its debt was forgiven after the Second World War in the London agreements, and it prospered. I think Germany could help to change some of the narratives around how the indebtedness of developing countries, especially countries in the global south, is understood as primarily only as a result of the mismanagement of this debt, as a result of corruption, as a result of things entirely within these countries. But I think that understanding of indebtedness and the many crises that are facing not just African countries, but many other countries, is too simplistic and an understatement of the many complex realities that these countries face. Just as an example, Mr. Estavao talked about the MRDI, which came after the HEPIC. And what he didn't talk about, and I think what Patricia spoke about quite eloquently, was how these programs all come with conditionalities that are high-cost conditionalities that include major cuts in public spending, that include decisions that governments have to make that are completely inconsistent with the obligations, the human rights obligations to provide basic services to their citizens. Many governments prioritize paying and servicing debts because of the indentures and the contractual provisions that they have signed. And many creditors know full well when they are lending these indebted governments that they may default or will default. And so I think the narrative that I think Germany can help in the G7 is the idea of co-responsibility, that all the actors are in this together, just like all the actors were in for Germany together after the Second World War, in a very successful example. And second, I would argue that another thing that might be very useful is to consider how some of the more fundamental reforms of the global debt architecture and international financial reform can be undertaken, whether it's the pending quota reform in the IMF that is due next year, and that might give some space for additional voice and vote for African countries, or whether it's in terms of supporting a mechanism for restructuring outside of the Bretton Woods institutions in a place like the United Nations. This idea has been proposed many times. If you remember, Joseph Stiglitz led a UN commission after the global financial crisis in 2008, came to almost similar solutions. I think we should surface all those discussions from the past to see which of these ideas can represent a better cross-section of all the interests in the sovereign debt crisis. And the final thing I want to say is, in terms of the narratives again of debt mismanagement, if you look at many African countries now, in Mozambique, we of course know the very important role civil society groups played there, the courts in invalidating sovereign debt contracts that had been procured illegally under Mozambican law. Here in Kenya, the High Court just this week ruled the government should produce, in terms of transparency, debt contracts that it had declined to produce. And one can go in country after country in Africa to show that there are actually very active forces that are on the side of helping Germany to meet these coalition agreements that it's made, and that it shall find lots of groups in solidarity supporting the important work that has to be done, so that the livelihoods of the poorest in these countries that is affected very negatively by the very high debt levels can be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now open the floor. There are already 3 questions from virtual participants. Are there questions from, there's already 1 question from 2. Okay, we will start with the virtual questions first. There are 2 that would like to be asked verbally. Let's take one of them. Let's take Matthew Martin, your question verbally. Can you please say to whom you would like to address the question when you start? And please identify yourself.
Sure. Did I unmute myself successfully?
Yep.
Yes, Matthew Martin, I'm head of Debt Relief International. Let me just first of all say that I really do agree with the timeliness of this event and with the diagnosis that there is a very widespread and deep debt crisis, and with the German coalition government's proposal for there to be a codified sovereign debt workout mechanism. And I really hope that that comes to fruition later this year, and that the reluctance of some other G7 countries to go along that route is not going to serve as an excuse for not doing it. But I think we're really going to need to build towards that in this current finance ministers meeting. So my questions were really, I had 2 questions and they were linked to that. And it seemed to me one question was that the fundamental reason why countries are not asking for debt relief, and this was being hinted at by Marcelo Estevao, I think, is that what currently is on offer from the common framework is completely unclear, and when it's clear, it's inadequate in terms of the debtors who are eligible, the speed with which relief will be delivered, the scale of the debt relief in terms of thresholds to set for when countries' debt is considered sustainable, the application of a standstill during negotiations, and whether all the creditors will participate. So my first question was, can the G7 not actually lead in clarifying all of those issues right now at its current meeting? And then we could have a much clearer assessment of how many countries actually want debt relief. My second question was linked to the issue about commercial creditors participating. And in the past, if you look back at the HIPC and Brady and all the previous initiatives, governments, notably in the G7, convinced commercial creditors to participate by combining regulatory measures, guaranteeing new bonds which were issued, having laws to stop what were called vulture funds from suing people and refusing to participate, and providing some tax relief. So why can the G7 not put these in place immediately and make participation of their commercial creditors mandatory based on that? Of course, I'm aware that there's a broader context of the G20 and that the G20 has taken over these types of financial decisions. But at the moment, when it looks from the IMF and World Bank spring meetings, like most decision-making in the G20 is entirely blocked for the time being as a result of the Ukraine invasion, then I suppose we need to come back to the G7 and ask them to take the leadership on clarifying those immediate issues right now, and on taking their own steps to make sure their commercial creditors participate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's potentially take the other related private sector questions as well to Mr. Schickermann. Miriam van der Stichele, would you like to ask your question as well? I assume this is related to Thomas Schickermann. Please correct me if that's not right.
Yes, I suppose you can hear me. Yes, indeed. Because we have been clarifying in all the arguments that the private creditors are basically based in the G7 countries. And we have seen in the DSSI, G20 can call on them, they don't respond. They have all kinds of arguments. They have provided all these papers. The IF has provided all these papers. It didn't help. So I was just wondering whether the G7 also is thinking not only about kind of the measures to be taken, but also whether they are wanted to involve the supervisors so that the private creditors come in the sense of, do you think that basically it should be considered as a systemic risk? And for the moment, the private creditors still have made a lot of profit, so they still have a possibility to kind of do a lot of restructuring. And in that sense, before the crisis comes, the interconnectedness is being is an issue, because I didn't see the Financial Stability Board, for instance, to say that the private debt is a problem. I just want to raise whether also the market mechanisms is not working. I mean, for instance, Ghana had a bond with 8.9 interest rate, which was because of the markets, but that was because there was a possibility of default. But then when the default comes, the private creditors are not willing to restructure, which actually they were being guaranteed through the interest rate. So how do you see also the involvement of the supervisors? And basically my question is, when there is a proposal for a codified insolvency procedures, what does this mean? What codifying will there be for the private sector?
Mr. Schickermann, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Many very relevant and also difficult question. Let me start with saying that Germany and also the other G7 are very positive on the IMF and World Bank's proposal to improve the common framework. First thing I would mention here is there's a general agreement in the G20 that a country that has requested a debt treatment according to the common framework can also request a debt standstill with the credit committee that is formed for this country. But up to now, no country has requested such a standstill, and it would have to be agreed in a consensual manner in the credit committee. We also are very much agreeing to the proposal of deadlines for the formation of the credit committee. And also we would agree to an extension that the common framework is not only eligible for low-income countries, but also to lower middle-income countries. But there are some countries, non-Paris Club countries in the G20 that are not agreeing to such proposals. So that's the situation where we are in. And second, I would like to stress that also from our perspective, collective action clauses are a very useful instrument. For 10 years now, the case of Greece has been resolved by applying such collective action clauses. There was a law in Greece that facilitated for that, On the other hand, it's better if such collective action clauses are just incorporated in the bonds when they have been issued. So that's the reason why the IMF is recommending since 2014 that all bonds issued under foreign law should contain collective action clauses, at best such ones that can avoid holdouts. For example, in Europe and in the European Union, we applied this rule since this year, and yeah, that's a very positive measure. And on the issue of a so-called independent debt restructuring mechanism, at the moment, that is not something that is currently discussed at G7 or G20 level. The SDIM proposal by the IMF 20 years ago did not find acceptance by the US and also by some emerging market economies like Brazil. We have now the G20 Common Framework. That's currently the best mechanism we can have to include non-Paris Club creditors and also private creditors. And we still have the Paris Club. And the most important thing is all creditors and the debtor country all have to play their role to make a necessary debt restructuring actually happen. Why I am also mentioning the Paris Club again is there are currently two examples. Sri Lanka and Suriname are being discussed to be treated as a Paris Club, and that is something that is also where countries that are not eligible to the common framework can apply for a debt restructuring. One prerequisite is there that the country should have an IMF program, and we are very much welcoming that Sri Lanka is now negotiating with the IMF to get an IMF program. And I don't know if I understand correctly the question concerning supervisors. If you are referring to what are the discussions in the Financial Stability Board, I must say I'm not very much an expert on this, but I can ask my colleagues what this body is doing with regard to debt restructurings. But I think they are mostly responsible for issues that refer directly financial markets, and the market-like instrument for debt restructurings are collective action clauses. But let me add to this that there is also a private sector working group that is discussing currently what can be done with regard to so-called climate resilient debt instruments. And this working group is working on a model term sheet for such bonds. And we would very much welcome if this work could end in presenting such model term sheets. I don't know if I forget an important question. Yeah.
I think we are going to come back to that. Let's take two questions from the floor here in Bonn. I've seen several hands. Peter and Jürgen, over to the microphone over there.
My name is Peter Lancet. I'm part of the steering committee of Lancier.de, the German Jubilee campaign. My question also goes to Mr. Shakerman, who probably has most of the questions tonight. It's already this point of the international insolvency procedure has been raised a number of times in the discussion already, and the fact that this coalition government, the present German coalition government, has it in its coalition treaty to take steps towards achieving that. Now, my question to Mr. Shakerman is that it's, of course, in international fora like the G7, there are other fora, of course, also, where this question, if at all one wants to take steps towards it, has to be raised, is it not? And so my question to you is whether, according to your knowledge in your ministry and in the discussion with your colleagues and probably also with the political side of the leadership of the ministry, whether there are any preparations, papers, discussions in your ministry, any strategy formation, how to take this question of global debt workout or insolvency could be taken up in international fora, which steps to be taken into this, which other countries to build a caucus with. Of course, there are political opponents. You already mentioned that right now there's no political appetite for that. The US, in particular, is not looking at that at all. Maybe other G7 countries also. But are there any such discussions, strategies, papers in the ministry? Can you give us any hope that there is some steps being done into this direction? Thank you.
Thank you. Jürgen Kaiser with Jubilee Germany. This is a bold move, Peter, to have asked for hope from the Ministry of Finance. I've got one comment and one question. The comment relates to the presentation of Mr. Estevao and the question to the ambassador. So the comment relates to the point you made about the need for multilateral debt relief. Yeah, we have been very pleased with the strong positions that David Malpass has taken on pointing to the threat of a global debt crisis, once again, together with Kristalina, of course. And I found it quite sobering, actually, when the question was asked about what was different with regard to the pre-HIPC situation. And then you pointed to the fact that debt indicators at that time were in the range of 100%, and today we're in the range of 55%. Apart from the fact that both is way beyond the levels identified as unsustainable in World Bank DSAs, I find them both misleading, actually, simply because in the pre-HIPC era, you had some outliers, particularly countries that had suffered from financial stress due to the wars that were waged in the context of the Cold War. You had countries like Nicaragua, Mozambique, Sao Tome, Angola, which were in the thousands with their debt to GNI ratios, while the majority of the countries at that time was not so far away from what we are having today. And on the other hand, you rightly pointed to the fact that the common framework, or whatever mechanism we are having, needs to take on board countries beyond the IDA group. Yeah, I mean, we are having Sri Lanka, Suriname, countries that are in debt distress, and rather middle-income countries at the moment. So the situation is a lot more comparable to what we had pre-HIPC before, and this is really cause for concern, because this now sounds like this old melody of kicking the can down the roads and toning down the need for action right now, and pointing to the fact that action could be taken later. That's really a concern for us when we hear that. The question to the ambassador is, when we talk about the need for bringing other countries on board, what proposals are you suggesting, or are you bringing into the political debate to, for instance, overcome the exclusion of countries which are in debt distress, but upper middle or lower middle income countries, and therefore excluded? How do you think this could be altered? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scheckermann, would you like to start? There was the question whether there is any hope. And I think there is also a question in general in the virtual chat on why could the G7 not just strongly improve the common framework by introducing national legislation to inhibit preferential recoveries by the private sector? Over to you.
So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. To begin with the last question you asked for, we have asked the IMF and the World Bank to analyze how effective anti-vulture laws in some countries, existing anti-vulture laws in some countries are, and such analysis could also bring a good basis for thinking about following measures. Concerning the coalition treaty in Germany, the German Ministry of Finance is striving in 2022 to get a more effective implementation of the common framework, as I have mentioned already, and regards this generally as an essential step to get a functioning international debt mechanism or debt restructuring mechanism. At the meeting of the finance ministers, the implementation of the common framework is also being discussed, and the G7 have reiterated at some occasions that they support the G20 and Paris Club common framework for debt treatment, and at the same time they urge for timely implementation and stand ready to implement improvements that can help debtor countries. As I mentioned before, we are very positive on what IMF and World Bank have been proposing, but you have to take into account that the common framework is a G20 process, and what is happening right now is a G7 conference, so that are a bit different things. But we are very hopeful that there will be a progress in the coming months. And as I mentioned, the cases that are currently being treated and discussed are going forward a bit slowly, but they are going forward. Thanks.
Ambassador Webson, there was a question directed to you.
Thank you very much. I think the mechanisms that we use right now does not include everybody. It's not all inclusive. So whether it is a mechanism for participation in the discussion as to how we set the levels for support or the criteria for support, or whether it is access to the available resources that can assist, such as the framework, none of those are all inclusive. There are countries, middle-income countries in the context of some of the CIDs, quite a number of CIDs, that are left out of the access to the resources that are available that would help, and therefore they have no voice within the conversation. And certainly within the setting up of the instruments to support, there is no opportunity. So there's only one place that you really can find us all sitting at the table, And I think the speaker from Kenya pointed out on a number of occasions in his presentation the need for the mechanism at the United Nations to be given. As we are discussing right now, the issues of the inclusiveness of a vulnerability index to be part of the process. Well, this is an opportunity where the voice of everybody is engaged in that discussion. And therefore, if and when that becomes a reality within the discussion of assessment, the financial institution should accept that, because that's one instrument that would have been given where everybody has an opportunity. Everybody is involved in the discussion because it is coming out of the United Nations system. And it is pointing at the issues, as the Secretary General have pointed out so many times, the issues that are affecting so many small states, from accessing concessional finance, accessing resources for within a debt framework that has been pointed out by agencies like the Alliance of Small Island States and so on. So that's one mechanism that we really need to begin to use more and more, and make it as inclusive as I think we are doing and seeing in the discussion that's taking place around the MVI, the Multi-Vulnerability Index. That conversation includes the World Bank, it includes the IMF, it includes donor countries and development partners, it includes OCDC countries and their agencies, and it has also attempted to bring in private sector engagement. So that's inclusive. That's the kind of voice we're talking about. That's when other countries, and that has to lead us to a mechanism that we can use in the future when we are talking about loans and the capacity to help countries in relieving this stress, the debt stress that we're under right now. Let me just make one last point that I think the colleague from Kenya made that is important here. What we have not talked about in any context, and we need to take into consideration in the discussion of debts, of the stress that countries are facing, and it would have been useful if all were engaged in the discussion. A lot of debt is historical debt some countries have. Debt that, I know in the case of some Caribbean islands, the debt goes back to when they were colonies, and you're still paying for them today. And there are mechanisms that we could speak to that will allow those to be addressed by providing an opportunity for the resources to be used in development rather than it to be external resources going out of the country and that they don't have, and not being able, therefore, to meet social challenges that the countries face.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We have lost Marcelo Estevao because he was called to an official meeting, therefore couldn't stay any longer. Would have loved to hear his reaction to the different questions that have been there, but hopefully next time. I would like, we still have 5 minutes left. I would like to give the other speakers, starting with Professor Gatti, the chance to react to the different comments, to the different questions. I think one question that I think is also interesting and is still open is the question, are we actually in a systemic crisis? Is there systemic risk? So should we also talk about systemic solutions? So if one of the panelists could also react to that. And then perhaps we have some more time for a question, but if not, then we are going to the end of the discussion.
So I agree that there's systemic risk, but the kind of systemic risk, the way I would frame it, in addition to the way that the report that Joseph Stigler co-wrote with a very distinguished set of panelists after they were asked to do so by the late Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations at the time. It's not just to think about systemic risk in the context of the way we understand global finance now, but also in the context in which I think the ambassador has just said, thinking about the vulnerabilities that some parts of the world have faced as a historical question. For example, for some countries, like Haiti, one of the poorest countries, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, they had an independence debt that they had to pay, and it took them hundreds of years to repay. Thomas Piketty, in some of his recent work, suggests that that historical debt that Haiti had to pay to owners of slaves because slavery was ending and Haiti was becoming independent was a key factor to the economic trajectory of Haiti. And there are many other examples like that, Tunisia and many others like that. So I think we should think in a broader historical context, not just in the narrow context of the post-Second World War period. So that's my first point. The second point, to emphasize—
just very quickly, because
yes, very
just
quickly.
3 minutes left.
Yeah, so the second point is just to say that in addition to relief, like Germany got after the Second World War, I agree with all the points made about a more encompassing framework that includes everybody and that is not just controlled at the IMF or other institutions like the Paris Club. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Dennis and Patricia, you have a minute to give your reaction to everything you've heard. Starting with Dennis.
All right, I'll try to manage. Thanks so much. In terms of systemic risk, certainly. So I think I'm on the same opinion as James. That, I mean, if we look at it, that half of the nation states of sub-Saharan Africa are currently labeled as being at risk, in debt distress, or at risk of debt distress. That clearly, when debt is at the highest levels in about 2 decades, and having risen at the fastest pace in about 3 decades, there is an underlying solvency issue with relation to many of the countries on the continent, which requires urgent attention. Now, the COVID-19 crisis itself was an opportunity, a unifying crisis when the attention was on of the global community in terms of fortuitously in terms of granting debt relief. That opportunity is sliding past us, but that does not mean that the opportunity is entirely past.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you. Well, first, the common framework is an initiative from the G20, yes, but it is endorsed by the G7. And there are G20 countries that are not part of the G7 that now are struggling with a debt restructuring process. And to rely on a club of creditors, as with all the limitation these processes have, is really not enough. Otherwise, our countries would have to make a club of debtors, and to avoid that, we insist on having a process in the United Nations. Then we welcome that there could be access to concessional finance through SDRs, and the IMF's RST has been mentioned, but this way to channel not used SDRs is through more debt, new loans, and with conditionalities. So I fear to say, and let's expect, if how many countries, as happened with the common framework, how many countries will knock on the RST doors. And then my country was a HIPIC country, and we went through the process of the MDRI and all that. And I disagree that that if we compare the debt situation, we are in a better situation now, and it's not really that complex. In the past, it was a matter of solvency, and HIPIC basically had a stock debt relief approach. And now we have a problem of liquidity, and that has not been addressed by the BSSI. And we have a problem as well of solvency, because we don't have any policy that says that our countries will increase their fiscal revenues and will have access to mobilize domestic revenues to repay those debts and to finance SDGs and climate and all the needs in the next years. So I think we have a two approach problem here, and we cannot be blind on that. And finally, in terms of the collective action clauses, it's a process to include them, and I think that of course it's important to include in all bonds issuance, but it's not a silver bullet. Probably it will in 30 years when all bonds have collective action clauses. But now we have a big part of bonds portfolio in our countries that don't have collective action clauses. And at some moment we'll have to go into a debt restructuring process without these clauses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. We are at the end of our discussion. I think the discussion will, of course, not end here. I'm not sure whether the question is answered, whether there's hope, but civil society will, of course, push very strongly for hope, as we don't want to accept political inaction, and that we really need to lose hope once and for all. Well, we are very excited to see the G7 Finance Ministers communique tonight or tomorrow. And there is, of course, the G7 Leaders Summit coming up. I think for now it remains to say thank you very much to the panelists virtually and here with me in Bonn, to the technical staff, to all your contributions, all your questions, and, well, have a wonderful day.